I do think there's been a lot of talk in Ireland about developing renewables. There's been a lot less action from the government on actually developing renewables. I mean, we see that yes, there's an increase in onshore wind farms, but again, can the government point to a single community wind farm in this state, or a single wind farm where there's a community dividend, other than, oh well, we'll pay for jerseys for the local GA club? Obviously, I think paying for jerseys for the local GA club is important, but you know, it tends to be a one-off measure, and when there's a pledge to give a certain amount of money to a GA club, it's a set amount, and of course, with inflation, etc., it amounts to very little in 20 years' time. Certainly a minuscule amount of money compared to what these wind farms can hope to generate, and I'd say generate in terms of money, not generate in terms of energy, because that's slightly less predictable. So, you know, if we're serious about moving forward, then why isn't a framework being put in place for community wind farms, for an actual dividend for the communities, as opposed to sort of sponsorship of a festival, or the stuff that, you know, is minuscule? The Minister might well argue that there's a dividend for the entire state, and that may be the case, but there's a particular burden for a particular community that has its environment degraded by the construction of a wind farm, and there's an inevitable degradation of the environment if you're building a wind farm in a blanket bog, for example, with the amount of concrete that you have to put in to stabilise it for the bases. But it's not. Some places obviously will have less environmental impact than others if you're building wind farms, but there's no particular dividend for that community. So that's a point I would make. But then offshore is the great moonshot of our generation, I think I heard the Taoiseach describe it as. But you know, our progress towards developing offshore wind generation has been painfully slow. Even now, the OREDB2 was initially expected to announce plans for floating offshore. It hasn't. Now there's to be a 2B plan, and now I believe there's speculation in the industry that might not even include floating offshore, and we might have to move to a phase 3 of the plan, which again, you know, there's in no way could the government's actions be seen to match their hyperbole and their talk on developing this. Well, we do know that investors have come here, they've gone to Foynes Port, they're you know, very excited at the prospects of floating offshore generation in Ireland, and then they look at what's actually happening in the state towards developing that, where we are, how close we are to being able to act on that, and we're nowhere near it. I mean, even this mapping that's required is obviously MARA has been established, but we don't even know who concretely is going to carry out the mapping. That needs to be determined, and determined quickly. Obviously, some local authorities have some additional capacity and expertise that could be brought to bear in this. Everything needs to be utilised, but I'm not convinced that the government are utilising this. I am convinced that the investors who want to invest in this clean, renewable energy are shaking their heads, just as the Minister might yawn at my next point as well. But 40% of Denmark's gas requirements are met from, I understand, biomethane through anaerobic digestive systems. The European Commission pointed out that Ireland and Denmark were perhaps the countries with the greatest capacity to replace natural gas usage with biomethane. Denmark is now at 40%. We're at what? 0? Maybe the Minister might give me the exact figure, but I'd say it's an awful lot closer to 0 than it is to 40%. I'd say it's even closer to 0 than it is to 1%. That's inexplicable. It's equally inexplicable that the government failed to apply to a European Union fund to support this, notwithstanding large numbers of potential investors, farmers groups, cooperatives, etc., who all want to move in this. No support whatsoever from the government or the permanent government for this. Instead, we're burning fracked gas. I mean, because a certain amount of the gas that comes into Ireland that's distributed is fracked gas. How does that in any way match the rhetoric of government? And can we say that that there will have been progression? Next year, as you face the electorate, as we all face the electorate, or those of us who wish to face the electorate will we have made any progress in that? It's not clear to me that we will have. So again, I would completely support the transition from a climate perspective, from an environmental perspective, from a social justice perspective, but equally just from a political perspective. It makes sense if we can generate energy ourselves that we should be doing so. But we don't seem to be moving in that direction. With regard to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's not something I know a lot about. It's something I researched. It was brought about by Pacific Island nations. It was initially proposed by them. I would say we have some things in common with them. Like Pacific Island nations, we use natural gas, and they import large amounts of natural gas, primarily LPG. We do too, but to announce a complete ban on exploration and extraction of fossil fuels in Ireland, natural gas included, in circumstances where we're importing large quantities of natural gas as LPG with a far greater carbon footprint, seems to me to make little sense. Because it's creating a greater carbon footprint. There's also, I suppose, the amount of fracked gas which is advertently or inadvertently consumed in Ireland, about which I think many people would be concerned. So I have to say, I think, again, the government's ban on exploration, any further exploration in Irish waters is fanciful in circumstances where we're importing LPG. Now, I did look, obviously the companies that are the states that have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty include Colombia and Timor-Leste, both countries with substantial gas reserves. But just from a very quick amount of research this morning, both of them are hailing, their state gas companies are hailing recent discoveries of gas and calling for investment to exploit that. So it does seem that there isn't that hasn't prevented them endorsing the treaty. So what exactly the treaty calls for, I'm not clear, but I do know the countries which have endorsed it are continuing to explore and are continuing to extract natural gas in their own territorial waters, which I suppose is less harmful to the environment ultimately than importing it on large tankers because of the carbon footprint that entails. But that's the method, that's the way we choose to go in Ireland, because, I don't know, maybe because it matches the rhetoric, maybe it helps leaders of parties get positions on to 10 minutes of fame, chair a COP meeting for a few hours. I don't know, and I'm sorry if that sounds cynical and jaded, but that's very much where our policies are at in Ireland, and that's very much where investors are at, because they listen to the rhetoric of government, and then they discover that it's utterly unmatched by any actions. Lastly, I suppose the motion talks about mechanised agriculture. I'm not entirely sure what's meant by that. If it means every farmer with a tractor, I'd have a problem with it. But I don't think that's what the motion means. I think it means this tendency towards ever increasing farms, ever increasing reductions in biodiversity, farmers being produced to get bigger and bigger and bigger, produce one crop and one crop only, to the detriment of biodiversity in their farms. It's not that they're choosing to do that, they're being forced to do that by an industry which is entirely unregulated, and again, the government policy around that is for that to increase rather than decrease. So I thank you for the time, and I support the motion.